It was a crisp autumn morning in Riverton, a mid-sized American city where the skyline was divided neatly. Old neighborhoods of red brick and peeling paint on one side, glass towers and manicured streets on the other. Darnell Brooks parked his battered white plumbing van in front of a tall, freshly painted apartment building. The words, Brooks and Son Plumbing, honest work, fair price, were barely visible through years of faded blue paint. He climbed out, toolbox in hand, wearing his usual gray work uniform and steel-toed boots. His palms were rough, his eyes tired but focused. He'd gotten a call late last night about a burst pipe on the third floor. Urgent, the property manager had said. It was the kind of job he couldn't refuse, even though it meant skipping breakfast and rushing through traffic. As he walked toward the entrance, the building's landlord stepped out of the lobby. Richard Callahan, a tall, middle-aged white man in a tailored navy coat. His shoes were polished, his hair perfectly in place, and his expression already disapproving. "You must be the plumber," Richard said flatly, glancing at Darnell's uniform. "Yes, sir," Darnell said politely. "You called about a busted line near apartment 3B?" Richard gave a short nod, folding his arms. "I expected someone from a bigger company. No offense, but this is a high-end building. We like to maintain certain standards." Darnell met his gaze evenly. "Understood. I've been doing this 20 years, sir. The pipe won't care about the logo on my van." Richard smirked faintly, unimpressed. "Well, let's just hope you know what you're doing. Tenants here are particular." As they rode the elevator up, the landlord eyed Darnell's toolbox, the worn handle, the faint scuffs on his boots. "You've got an assistant, right?" "Not today," Darnell said. "My son's got school." Richard raised an eyebrow. "School? Didn't realize trade folks sent their kids to college these days." Darnell's voice stayed calm. "He's studying engineering at Riverton Tech. Smart kid." There was a brief silence. The elevator dinged. When they reached the third floor, the hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint and expensive air freshener. Richard pointed toward a door. "That's the one. Tenants at work, so just make sure it's clean when you're done." Darnell nodded. "Always is." Inside, the damage was worse than expected. Water pooling near the baseboards, wallpaper bubbling. Darnell got to work immediately, unscrewing pipe fittings, steady hands moving with practiced precision. Richard lingered by the doorway, checking his watch impatiently. "You sure you're qualified for this?" Darnell didn't look up. "Licensed, insured, and city certified. You're welcome to check." Richard gave a dry laugh. "Oh, I'm sure the city hands those certifications out like candy these days." The remark hung in the air. Darnell's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd heard worse. He just kept working, calm, professional, methodical. An hour later, he stood up, wiped his hands, and turned the main valve back on. The pipes hummed quietly. No leaks. Perfect seal. "All fixed," Darnell said simply. Richard leaned in, testing the faucet. It ran smooth and steady. "Well," he said almost reluctantly, "guess you did all right." Darnell nodded. "Glad you're satisfied, sir." As he packed up, Richard followed him to the elevator again. "You've been in business long?" "Almost 15 years. "Impressive," Richard said, though his tone was half condescending. "Bet that keeps you busy. Don't imagine there's much time left over for anything else." Darnell smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised what people make time for." When he got back to his van, he pulled out a stack of flyers sitting in the passenger seat, crisp white with bold lettering across the top. "Darnell Brooks, for City Council, District 4. He looked at them for a long moment, then sighed, wiping the grease from his hands before tucking one into his clipboard. Back upstairs, Richard stood in the hallway, shaking his head. "Good worker," he muttered to himself. "But some people just don't know their place." He didn't know that by next month, that same worker would be standing on a debate stage, looking straight into the camera, and straight into the hearts of the same people who once looked down on him. That evening, Darnell Brooks parked his van in front of a modest two-story house on the city's south side. Chipped paint, uneven driveway, a basketball hoop, leaning slightly in the front yard. To anyone else, it might have looked ordinary. To Darnell, it was home. As he stepped inside, the smell of fried chicken and cornbread filled the air. His mother, Mrs. Lorraine Brooks, was standing by the stove, humming softly to an old Sam Cooke song playing on the radio. You're late again, she said without turning around. Job ran long, Darnell said, setting his toolbox by the door. Burst lineup in Riverton Heights. Fancy place. Fancy people. Lorraine smirked. And how'd they treat you this time? He hesitated, pulling off his gloves. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like I borrowed the van instead of owning it. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. You've been fixing their messes your whole life, baby. One day they'll have to see you for who you really are. Darnell smiled softly. That's the plan, Ma. At the dining table, his son Malcolm, 19, sat hunched over a laptop, papers spread everywhere. You eat yet, Dad? Not yet, Darnell said. How's school? Malcolm grinned. Exams next week. Hard, but good. Professor said I've got a shot at that city internship if I keep my grades up. Darnell patted his shoulder proudly. That's my boy. You'll go farther than I ever did. Malcolm turned, curious. Hey, how's the campaign stuff going? You send in your filing yet? Darnell sighed, glancing at the pile of paperwork on the counter. Registration forms, district maps, voter data. Almost. Just keep putting it off. Guess I'm trying to convince myself I belong in that race. Lorraine sat beside him, her eyes warm but firm. You belong in any room where people make decisions that affect folks like us. You've been fighting for this city from under sinks and basements for 20 years. Now it's time to fight for it in a chair that matters. Darnell chuckled. You make it sound easy. Nothing worth doing ever was, she said. He nodded slowly, then reached for the folder labeled Campaign Materials. Inside were the flyers he'd printed. Plain, white background, bold navy text. Darnell Brooks for City Council, leadership that works. Malcolm picked one up, studying it. You should add a slogan, he said. Something that sounds like you. Darnell smiled. And what's that supposed to sound like? Malcolm grinned. Like the guy who fixes things. You fix pipes, Dad. Maybe it's time to fix the system, too. Darnell laughed, shaking his head. You're going to be dangerous when you grow up. But that night, when everyone went to bed, he sat alone at the table, the house quiet except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. He stared at the campaign form in front of him, the one that required his signature to make it official. He thought about every broken pipe, every landlord who'd watched him like a suspect, every time someone had said, "You people," with a smile that didn't reach their eyes. He thought about how hard his mother had worked, how much his son was striving to build something better. Then, slowly, deliberately, he picked up a pen and signed his name. Darnell A. Brooks, candidate for Riverton City Council, District 4. He sat back and exhaled, the paper trembling slightly under his hand. The next morning, before heading to his first call, he stopped by the post office and mailed the envelope. And as he walked back to his van, he felt something he hadn't in a long time, the steady, quiet pulse of hope. He wasn't just fixing leaks anymore. He was about to start fixing something much bigger. 2 weeks later, the city of Riverton woke to a headline that turned heads across coffee shops and office lobbies. Local tradesman enters city council race. Darnell Brooks aims to fix what's broken. The article described him as a community plumber and small business owner with deep roots in the district. It mentioned his decades of service work, his mentorship of local youth, and his reputation for honesty. All things that people in the working neighborhoods already knew. But to those on the wealthier side of town, his name was new, including Richard Callahan. He was in his office on the top floor of his newest apartment complex, flipping through emails, when his assistant dropped the newspaper on his desk. You've got to see this, she said. Richard skimmed the headline, then froze. The photo beside it showed Darnell, standing in front of his old van, sleeves rolled up, smiling confidently at the camera. The same man who'd fixed his burst pipe 2 weeks ago. The same man he'd dismissed as just a plumber. He blinked, rereading the name. Brooks? He muttered. You're kidding me. His assistant laughed nervously. Looks like he's serious. Says here he's running in your district, too. Richard frowned. He'd always taken pride in being a man of business sense, someone who understood the system. But something about this news unsettled him. The idea that a plumber, a man he'd barely respected enough to thank properly, was running for council seemed absurd. By lunchtime, the story was all over town. The radio station ran a brief segment about grassroots candidates shaking up the race. Social media was flooded with photos of Darnell handing out flyers near the farmers market, shaking hands, listening to residents talk about potholes, water bills, and neglected neighborhoods. His slogan was simple but powerful: real work, real change. Meanwhile, across town in the tidy brick offices of the Riverton Landlord Association, Richard's circle of colleagues discussed the race over coffee. "Brooks, isn't that the guy who fixed your building's pipe?" one asked with a chuckle. "No, the same," Richard said tightly. "You've got to admit," another added, "that's kind of impressive." "Impressive?" Richard scoffed. "This city needs professionals in office, not plumbers with dreams." But his tone betrayed something, a flicker of defensiveness, maybe even unease. Because beneath his cynicism, he knew what Darnell represented: someone who understood the city's cracks from the inside out. That evening, Darnell was out canvassing with his son Malcolm and a few volunteers. They went door to door through neighborhoods where the sidewalks were cracked and the streetlights flickered. Some folks recognized him immediately. "Hey, you fixed my kitchen sink last summer," one woman said. "Yes, ma'am," Darnell replied with a smile, handing her a flyer. "Now I'm trying to fix City Hall." The line got a laugh every time, but it wasn't a joke. It was his truth. Later that week, a small local TV station invited all council candidates for a roundtable discussion. Darnell arrived in his clean work shirt and jacket, while the others wore suits and ties. When the moderator introduced him as a self-made tradesman running to represent working families, he nodded humbly. "I've seen this city from the basements up," Darnell said. "I know where the pipes leak, I know which corners flood, and I know how hard it is to get a straight answer from anyone at City Hall. I'm not running for power, I'm running for accountability." Across town in his living room, Richard Callahan sat watching the segment with a glass of wine. He couldn't look away. Darnell's voice was calm, measured, but confident. The kind of confidence that came from knowing what real work felt like. When the broadcast ended, Richard turned off the TV and stared into the quiet room. For the first time, he wondered if maybe the plumber he'd looked down on wasn't beneath him at all. Maybe he was the kind of man this city actually needed. Still, he told himself it was just a phase, a novelty story that would blow over. But it didn't. By the end of the month, Brooks for Council signs began popping up across both sides of Riverton. In front yards, storefronts, and even outside the community center Richard had once refused to sponsor. Everywhere Richard went, it seemed. Darnell's steady face and firm eyes were there too, not asking for attention, but earning it. And deep down, Richard felt something he hadn't expected. Not anger, not resentment, but fear. Because for the first time, he could see the balance of power shifting, from those who owned the buildings to those who'd built them. By late spring, Riverton's District 4 race had become the talk of the city. What started as a quiet grassroots effort was now a full-fledged movement. Darnell Brooks's campaign signs stood proudly on lawns beside flower beds and porches. His slogan, "Real work, real change," was painted across fences, storefronts, and pickup trucks. But with visibility came resistance. Flyers began disappearing overnight. Anonymous comments on social media questioned his experience and mocked his blue-collar background. At one neighborhood forum, a man asked loudly, "How's a plumber supposed to manage city budgets?" Darnell only smiled and replied, "Sir, when you've managed to stretch a week's pay to cover 3 jobs and still pay your workers fair, budgets don't scare you. Waste does." The room had gone silent after that. Still, not everyone was convinced. And one man in particular wasn't ready to let go of his pride: Richard Callahan. He'd been invited to a city business association event downtown, a glossy networking mixer full of real estate developers, investors, and council members. It was the kind of room he'd always felt comfortable in, until he saw Darnell walk in. Darnell wasn't wearing his work uniform this time. He had on a tailored gray suit, crisp white shirt, and the same quiet confidence that had carried him through every challenge in his life. He shook hands, greeted people warmly, and when he laughed, it wasn't nervous or forced. It was genuine. A few heads turned, some guests whispered, realizing who he was. "That's the plumber running for council," someone murmured. Richard watched from the bar, swirling the ice in his glass. Something about the sight of Darnell mingling among Riverton's elite stirred an old, uncomfortable bitterness in him, the kind that comes from realizing you might have underestimated someone badly. After a few minutes, he walked over. "Well, if it isn't the city's new celebrity handyman," he said with a forced smile. Darnell turned, surprised but calm. "Evening, Mr. Callahan." "I saw your name in the paper again," Richard continued. "Quite the leap, from fixing pipes to fixing politics." Darnell chuckled softly. "They're not so different. Both take patience, steady hands, and a lot of cleanup after other people's messes." A few nearby guests stifled smiles. Richard's jaw tightened. "I suppose some of us prefer to leave politics to the professionals?" "Maybe that's the problem," Darnell said, his tone still even. "Too many professionals. Not enough people who understand what real work feels like." Richard crossed his arms. "So that's your campaign message? That hard work makes you qualified to run a city?" "It's what qualifies anyone," Darnell said. "Honest work, honest heart. You don't need a corner office to care about your neighbors." Before Richard could respond, the event's moderator announced that the candidates for District 4 would be giving brief remarks. The crowd shifted toward the small stage. Richard lingered near the back as Darnell took the microphone. His voice was calm, deep, and steady. "I've spent 20 years fixing things that people don't see. Leaky pipes, bad wiring, cracks behind the walls. The truth is, our city's got the same kind of problems. Things that look fine on the surface but are falling apart underneath. But if we want real change, we can't keep painting over rust. We have to rebuild from the inside, with honesty, hard work, and the belief that everyone, no matter where they start, deserves a voice." A wave of quiet applause spread through the room. Not polite, but genuine. Even some of the business owners who had dismissed him earlier nodded slowly. Richard stood in the back, arms at his sides. For a moment, he couldn't move. Darnell's words hit deeper than he wanted to admit. They weren't rehearsed or political. They were real. After the speeches, Darnell stepped down, shaking hands with attendees. Richard approached again, his voice quieter this time. "You speak well," he said. "Didn't expect that." Darnell smiled faintly. "That's the thing about expectations, Mr. Callahan. Sometimes they say more about the person holding them than the person being judged." Richard didn't answer. For once, he didn't have a comeback. Later that night, as Darnell packed up campaign flyers from his van, he thought about the look on Richard's face, the mixture of shock, pride, and something else. Maybe realization. He didn't feel smug or victorious, just hopeful. Because maybe, just maybe, the walls between people like him and people like Richard were starting to crack, not from force, but from truth. And as he drove home through the quiet streets, the lights of Riverton flickering on the wet pavement, Darnell felt something stronger than ambition: purpose. He wasn't running to win power. He was running to change minds. And piece by piece, it was working.